You're at Columbia, right?
Yeah.
How long you been there?
My whole adult life.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's always been in neuroscience?
Yeah, I started in, I got my PhD in biology, but even there I was doing neuroscience.
Okay.
So I've been doing neuroscience of one sort or another for almost 40 years.
Okay. When did you get into music?
Oh, when I was 8. So I grew up in Southern Illinois, and my parents were from the East Coast, from New York. My father was a fan of a lot of different kinds of music, but didn't really play anything except harmonica. He was a fan of 1940s blues, Sonny Terry, Lead Belly, stuff like that, which was very popular in his generation in New York, and also became very influential because British rock and roll scene kind of came out of that. When I was 17, I got to play with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGhee. And I had an interesting conversation with Brownie. I said, oh, well, you guys used to make those records with Woody Guthrie. And I said, what was it like working with that guy? And he said, just absolutely normal. Just talk to him the same way that I'm talking to you now. And that was kind of interesting for me because when I grew up, that generation of folk musicians was very highly celebrated. And it was nice to hear that, not only was Brownie McGhee a down-to-earth person who took his music very, was really put in a lot of energy to trying to be good. But that was also a little eye-opening because he and Sonny Terry would fight like a couple in a bad marriage. Just, constantly insulting each other. And that was part of it, was my father's influence. Part of it was being a kid when rock and roll was very exciting. Everybody my age grew up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all that kind of thing. And also because I was growing up sort of in small town mid-America, I heard a lot of R&B from Memphis, which was close by, and a lot of country western from Nashville, which was also not so far, and a lot of influence from St. Louis. So where I grew up wasn't all that far from where Miles Davis grew up. So part of it was growing up there. And as I was quite young, I would hear people like Chet Atkins, Del Reeves. They would come in and play my hometown. Plus pop acts like, I remember hearing Simon and Garfunkel and Jethro Tull when I was a kid. Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf would play my hometown, although I was really too young to get into the bars and hear them. Minnie Riperton was living there at the time. So even though it was a small town, there was a lot of music. And then my mother played a little piano. She played a little bit of classical piano. Both of my parents were music lovers. When I was really young, when I was 7 or 8, the things that really made a big impression, everybody was turned on by the Beatles, of course. I mean, you couldn't possibly escape it. And all the other music of that period. Hearing George Gershwin's music made just a really profound impression on me, and still does. So I would say that that's kind of that amalgam is how I got interested in music, but I didn't really know about contemporary jazz or classical music until I was a teenager.
You played a guitar?
I started when I was really young, like 6 or 7 or something, on the piano. And then when I was in, I'm going to say fourth grade, they used to have, you will remember this, but a lot of the younger people won't, that all the schools used to have instrument programs. We had traveling music teachers. And so I started playing the viola. Then when I was 11, between 11 and 13, I started playing the guitar and the five-string band. I'd become a big fan of Earl Scruggs and bluegrass music, which isn't really native to Southern Illinois, but there were people down there playing. We grew up only about 40 miles from the Kentucky border. So we really weren't that far away from bluegrass. It was just slight differences in the culture there. It was more similar to Memphis than it was to more central and western Kentucky.
You went then to undergraduate school in music?
No, again, around 13, 14, I fell in love with plants. And I would take long walks in the forest and bring field guides and try to learn all the plants. And when I went to college, I majored at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, where, by the way, that's where I started studying with Roscoe Mitchell, because Roscoe lived outside of town there. He was not a professor there. He was just a guy that lived in a little town called Langsburg, Michigan. And he was playing with the art ensemble, so he had quite a career, but it was probably just coincidence that he was living around Lansing. Roscoe and Marianne lived on a farm, on an apple farm. When I was 17, I started, I was a year early, so I started going to college up there. I became a real fan of Roscoe and the art ensemble at that period. I was a DJ on the college station. I would play their stuff a lot. When I realized that Roscoe would give music lessons, I jumped at it. And in fact, I didn't have any money. What I would do is trim his apple trees in return for getting music lessons. But my degree was in horticulture and botany, plant genetics. That's what I thought I was going to do to make a living. Roscoe was the first person I'd ever met who really, really practiced, because when I grew up in, these small towns, there would be good musicians, but they weren't the type that were playing 3 or 4 hours a day to try to really hone their craft. Roscoe was the first person I ever met. He had a profound impression on me in a number of ways. Our exercises were to write out solos in the style of Charlie Parker that he would criticize, try to show us how to improve them. And we spent a lot of time just reading through Bach pieces.
At some point, you studied composition?
With Roscoe, I studied composition. I had decided, I guess when I was 16, that I was a composer. And the reason I decided that was because I had heard Eddie Palmieri. And that really changed my mind about what being a composer meant, because I didn't know anything about contemporary classical music. Nobody in my circle did. So anything after Stravinsky was just, I didn't know about. Anything after Schoenberg and Stravinsky were absolutely the most modern thing I was aware of. I just had this feeling that tradition, while a beautiful tradition, had just sort of died out. And it was really hearing Palmieri that made me realize, no, this thing is very much alive, because I realized that the arrangements that he was doing had to be completely written out, rather than the way I came up, which, and I think most people did if they don't come from a classical background, is you play in a band. So, I started playing in bands when I was 14. In a band, you have different people that play the different instruments, and you say, here's the song, and then everybody works out their own part. Of course, that's obviously what all the pop music of the period was made in that way. And then the jazz that I was aware of was made that way too. But when I heard Palmieri, I said, oh my God, they can't be that way. Even though I'd heard, Duke Ellington, that was older music to my mind. Now, when I hear Ellington, I think it's easily as contemporary, if not futuristic, compared to anything else out right now. But at the time, it seemed, well, the big bands, that was another period. Music has moved on. Of course, that's wrong, but that's how I felt. Realizing people were doing very exciting stuff by writing it all out really changed my mind. And that's why I told Roscoe I want to study composition. So in a sense, I started studying composition with him, and I'd bring in pieces and ask him to criticize them. I did a lot of playing and performing, but I resumed studying composition when I was in my early 20s, maybe 24, because I was writing music again. I'd started my string quartet and I was writing the material. Part of the reason I started the string quartet was because I felt so enamored of Joseph Haydn. Haydn was this amazing contrapuntalist or polyphonic writer who could take four voices and make really extraordinary compositions from these four voices. And I also felt that that was mirrored in contemporary America by the trap set drums, which is very highly polyphonic as well. It's one player playing sometimes many different rhythms on many different instruments. I thought it made sense to put together the strings and the trap set drums to do something that's highly contrapuntal and polyphonic. And that's when I started my string quartet. As I was doing that, I felt, well, I'm very much really in this tradition of classical music. But even though I grew up, as I was mentioned, playing the viola and had, when I was very young, played some classical piano, most of my life was spent playing essentially American pop, rock, R&B, country and Western, and these sorts of styles. And I said, I really don't know the classical tradition sufficiently. So I took night classes in composition at Juilliard from a fellow named Jeff Langley. At some point, Jeff said, okay, I think you have to go to the next level. He said, I'll get you lessons with David Diamond. But I just wasn't that interested in David's work. It just didn't do very much for me. And so I tried to find a teacher. I was also DJing at the college radio station. There is WKCR at Columbia. And I happened to meet Otto Luning, who was one of the inventors of the synthesizer. And he and Ussachevsky were the inventors of tape music. Well, not exactly, but made it tape music the same year that a fellow in France named Pierre Schaeffer was doing it, and then Stockhausen in Germany. So they all sort of developed what they call tape music at the same time. To tell the truth, Les Paul beat them all because Les Paul had done stuff even earlier than they did, but not by that much. The tape recorders had just become possible to obtain. So Ussachevsky, Otto, and Milton Babbitt, who at the time was a professor at Princeton, to my knowledge, were the principal people that said we need to build a synthesizer, and started working with the engineers at RCA to do that. I became friends with Otto, who was nearly 60 years older than I was, but we actually became genuine friends. And he started giving me lessons. So that would be, I would say, my third composition teacher. At that point, I was already making records and so on of my compositions. And so Otto always said, well, I'm your coach. I'll be your coach. Very recently, I've started getting coaching again, one from a good friend who's the top flamenco musician in the States named Pedro Cortez. And I'm a little bit from another flamenco musician who is probably about the most influential one that's around right now, named Diego Amador. He lives in Spain. To get an honest opinion from somebody about the quality of your creative work is so incredibly rare. And even if they don't like it, it's something to be highly valued.
So given your interest in plants,
mm-hmm.
and given your interest in music,
mm-hmm.
you brought that together with what you're doing at Columbia. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, I guess. Yeah, sure.
Because as I read, the title of your new book is Music, Math, and Mind. And I understand you teach a course with that title also?
I do.
Okay. So do you conceive of that as trying to bring together those two disciplines?
Well, not plants so much, but I would say it's bringing together music and mathematics and what we call neuroscience.
one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with you a bit, aside from your vast background and experience, is this whole notion of music conveying emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And repeatedly, I hear from musicians, but from conductors and so on, that talk about, for example, a work of Mozart conveying emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I always react with, I don't hear that. I don't get that. And so I've been thinking about, how do we put meaning to music? We're very imprecise when we're talking about emotions and feelings. People don't differentiate between the two. And at least I think one way to look at it is that emotion is something that can be measured physiologically, where feelings, maybe not. Feelings are cognitive processes.
Mm-hmm.
Is that consistent with the way you look at it?
Well, I don't know, William. I mean, you're saying that you think that emotions stem from conscious effort, I guess.
No, emotions happen because we're wired for them to happen under certain circumstances, whereas feelings are our cognitive interpretation of what we think the emotion is. But it's a cognitive process as opposed to, is that anything you've ever run across in your own thinking about this?
No, I've never really tried to differentiate feelings and emotion, and I understand that you are saying that you think that's important. I wouldn't even be able to define the difference. I mean, I understand you are, but I just for me, it's very fuzzy.
I grant that. What I've read is there are those who say that emotions can be measured physiologically.
They can or cannot?
Can.
Okay.
All right.
Or feelings can't be measured physiologically?
Right. Feelings, well, you can measure them, but often you have to use some kind of cognitive process to get them. A survey, talking, something or other. They're not directly accessible. They're the person's expression of what they think they have experienced. And as a psychologist, I'm not big into introspective characterizations of, because
you're more a Skinnerian. You want to look.
Yeah, because they're essentially not measurable. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the question I've always asked is there something inherent in music, in its physical properties, that can cause, without some kind of mediation, as best as we can tell, cognitive mediation, does it cause a reaction?
Well, music absolutely causes reactions, physiological reactions, no doubt about it. You can measure this in, for instance, measuring brainwave activity. And not just in people, you can measure this in virtually any animal that has an ear and a brain. So if you put electrodes on the acoustic cortex, and you play sounds, you're going to get a response. If you play music in rhythm or sounds in rhythm, you're going to get rhythmic responses. So there's no, and that's just what we can easily measure.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of other outcomes that are happening that are more difficult for us to measure, but of course, we can feel very confident that they're there.
Right. On the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean the subject was experiencing some kind of emotion from the music.
Emotions are hard to measure, as you said. We don't really have great ways to measure emotion. This is why, for instance, people that have been studying responses to music, like Robert Zatorre, who's at Montreal, will sometimes measure things like goosebumps. I mean, who gives a damn about goosebumps? But on the other hand, it's something you can actually observe. You don't have to ask somebody if they have goosebumps. There are a bunch of studies using brain imaging that will try to say, here's the response. There's release of a neurotransmitter, or there's activation in a particular part of the brain, increased activation. And we're assuming or guessing that that corresponds to an emotion. If we have emotions, and I think we all agree that we do, and we have feelings, and I don't think anybody disagrees that any animal with a nervous system doesn't feel. After that, we just have to admit that that emotions are very hard to describe, and even feelings can be hard to describe unless there's something like that hurts or I feel cold. After a certain amount of very basic description, it becomes very hard. And even imagining how we're ever going to get a little more quote quantitative end quote about it becomes very challenging. I'm not sure we're going to get there in the near future, at least to where we'd want to be, to say, listening to the sonata pathétique made me feel sad. I think what I just said is about what we can say. Did it make you feel sad 3 out of 10 or 8 out of 10? That's going to be a tough one.
I've thought that we get the meaning out of music by our associations. Again, talking about Skinner, but we've all grown up with music that we hear in certain circumstances. And those circumstances help define our reaction to the music.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, minor scales are thought in our particular culture to be sad, and in the Middle East are not thought that way at all.
I was wondering about that because I wondered if that was a cross-cultural standard.
No, certainly not. Certainly not.
Okay. And
listen to Jewish dance music. I mean, I'm sure you've heard klezmer. I mean, it's mostly in a minor key or a Phrygian key.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of cultures that use those for dance music. Greek, Gypsy, Spanish, and then the dance music from Indian subcontinent can be all sorts of different scales that to us might sound at least a little troubling, perhaps. But to them, no, this is how you play happy dance music, where everybody gets up and claps and dances in a circle. So certainly, it's absolutely culturally defined. Many of these things are culturally defined, and some of them aren't. So, some aspects of music are quite universal, even to other species. There's some pretty striking video that Sue Savage Rumbaugh and Peter Gabriel made of Kanzi playing the piano. And when Kanzi, who's a bonobo, starts to play, she discovers the octave and the fifth and plays them over and over again while Peter's playing a chord. So that would be a striking example. But then there were plenty more, from birdsong and whale song, and my own experience with the Thai Elephant Orchestra, where consonance means something very similar for our species and for other species. And that's based in math. That's based on multiples. It's based on the overtone series and where waves reinforce each other and where they don't. So certain aspects of music, I think, are essentially universal, or if not universal, at least common amongst the organisms with auditory cortex.
I assume rhythm is one of the things that may not be called.
Listen to birds. I mean, of course obviously they have rhythm when they sing. Their rhythms can be much faster than ours, so a little hard for us to follow. But if you slow down bird songs, very often you'll hear a rhythm that makes sense to us. They just think so much faster than we do. For most songbirds, we are just dull, slow-witted, boring creatures. They can't. I think they're astonished at how slow we are. And we if we lower their songs in pitch, you play it back on a tape recorder at half speed, or you can do it digitally. Often the songs start to become more beautiful to us, but one suspects much more boring to the bird.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you listen to music?
Yeah.
You may be surprised, but I've interviewed a lot of musicians who don't.
That I am surprised, because I have a lot of friends who are professional musicians who don't go out to hear music. And I think that that's really strange. But I understand that the burnout factor in people trying to make a living can be really extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So I do understand that. But I would think that if musicians aren't listening to music, unless they're doing some other kind of listening, that I would think they would start to get very crabby and insular and cut off from the rest of their world. So I really would not think that's a good idea.
What kind of music do you listen to?
I've listened to many kinds of music, but during the pandemic, I've been listening to a good amount of gospel music by, with choir. Trey McLaughlin is somebody I've recently discovered. It's only recently that I've heard Kirk Franklin for a long time, but never really made an impression on me. But just during the pandemic, I go like, okay, now I get it. He's really a talent. He's really an exceptional talent. And some other gospel singers, but mostly the choirs. I really like what's been happening in the last 20 years with gospel music. I started the first kind of newer group that really impressed me, although he's an older man, is Milton Brunson and the Thompson Community Singers. But a lot of other stuff has come out since then. And they are using very advanced harmonies now, sort of similar to Robert Glasper, the jazz pianist, who you probably know. So the way that Robert uses superimposed harmonies from different chords is very much been taken up by gospel music. So the pianists in that music are really very advanced. They're taking the American pop tradition and gospel tradition from people like James Cleveland and Aretha Franklin and so on, but they're moving it in a very contemporary direction, which is quite fascinating. I've been listening to some old classical music. I discovered for myself a pianist named Marcel Meyer, who lived in the 1930s and 40s and was sort of a colleague of people like Maurice Ravel and a group that came after Ravel and Debussy in Paris. And but she also, people like Mio, but she also plays Scarlatti very, very beautifully. I, went through a little period listening to Jacob Collier, and I think he's very talented, and we'll see what develops. He has so much talent, and his solo, rather a cappella vocal pieces are really astonishing. The pop stuff is very promising, but we'll have to see how he develops. But I really respect what he's trying to do. Well, I mean, in jazz, like everybody, I'm very impressed by Kamasi Washington. I mean, I think he's taken one kind of tradition and put another tradition in there as well, which is, and he deserves his popularity, in my opinion. In jazz, I think you always need this infusion of challenges. So it's gone very far in this direction. Let's put something in to try to bring it in another direction, and I think he's doing that. Particularly how he's using strings and vocals, I think is really nice, and then using essentially the harmonies from contemporary R&B. So I think that stuff's great. Those are ones that just come to mind immediately for what I've been listening to during the pandemic.
It sounds to me that the things that you like are to some degree based on your understanding of music itself.
Yeah, that's probably true.
That it may not be something that somebody would go to look on YouTube because it sounds good, but for you, it has some particular meaning because of your background.
Well, for me, it does sound good. So to me, when I hear what Diego Amador is doing now, it just, it's so beautiful. I want to cry. He just did a recording that you may find corny, but I just find is fantastically good, with my friend Pedro Cortez and a singer who just passed named La Susi. And it's to me, it's gorgeous. But to other people, they might say, oh, it's sappy. I think it's very deep and heartfelt. So I'm not sure that's really addressing what you're saying.
Of course, we all have reasons for why we like what we like.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, I think people in music are in fact imprecise when they say things like they like it because it is conveying an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's okay just to say I like the music. It sounds good to me.
Yeah, sure.
And that's reason enough. And that may be an emotion in itself, but geez, then everything we ever do could be classified as an emotion. Do you know what I'm saying? Every thought.
Yeah. Well, maybe everything we can do, it should be associated with emotion, and maybe every kind of music we hear can sound good and be classified as an emotion. There's not that much music I hear that I don't like. Even there's occasional music that I'll hear and I'll say, I really respect it. I respect the talent and hard work and creativity of the person that's doing it, but it just doesn't do much for me. That does happen, especially with a lot of pop music, because, for good or bad, somebody does something popular and then a lot of other people do the same thing. And then I start to say, okay, all right, but where's your personality in this thing? Why are you suddenly sounding like Taylor Swift? Why are you doing that? You don't have to do that. And then I get a little turned off, but then I say, yeah, but they're doing it really well. And I also like and have done a lot of music with people that have never played an instrument in their lives. And I also can really love that. So I would say it's pretty hard for me to find, I don't think there's a genre of music I don't like. Even like listening to the music from kabuki theaters and for Chinese opera, which I know in our culture is not listenable by a lot of people, but to me it is. I think it's great. I like Harry Parch. A lot of people. I have friends who say, "Wait, that just sounds awful." To me, it's gorgeous. And there's a lot of pop music that I think is fantastic. So, it's hard for me to find a style of music I don't like. But I'll definitely, as I think you're implying, I'll go after maybe a particular thing and try to explore it at a specific depth. See, it bothers me that, like when you're saying there are all these professional musicians who don't listen to music anymore, because I understand that, if you're spending all your time trying to learn an instrument very, very well, that can just be so overwhelming that you just want to do anything else for the rest of the day. I do understand. Nevertheless, I think at some point that becomes destructive to being creative. We had a woman living upstairs in my apartment, the upstairs apartment. She's first to the second violinist. And she didn't seem to listen to music at all. I thought, oh, great. Principal violinist moved upstairs. I'll give her the music I've written for violin. No, she never looked at it or listened to it. And it's not curious about it. So she became obviously a really stellar technician with a important career and an important position. But I also think that she didn't develop into somebody who's really going to go beyond that. Heifetz, if you ever listened to him, was somebody that continued to be musically curious, would learn the Sibelius Symphony, would arrange Gershwin pieces or Spanish pieces or jazz pieces. Even if he never became much of a jazz musician, he played stuff in the style that was really wonderful. And there's nobody who's a better technician than Heifetz. He's the top violin technician in history, but also one of the great musicians who played the violin in history. I don't think he I believe eventually burned out, but not because of lack of love of listening to music. I think he burned out because at some point, literally, he lost the strength in his elbow.
One could hypothesize that for people in orchestras,
mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a great artist, but you should be a pretty good technician.
No, they burn out. They burn out and become, it's very sad because they spend their lives mastering an instrument, and yet there's a lot of bitterness in that field that
Mm-hmm.
you'd find much less in jazz,
mm-hmm.
where playing an instrument well is very important, but continuing to be creative is easily as important.
Well, it's interesting because when you play in a large orchestra, the only people who really hear how good or bad you are your standmates.
Right.
And maybe the conductor.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time you're buried in with 15 other people.
Certainly if you're in the strings.
Right.
Different if you're the trumpet player or the
bassoon. Exactly. Yeah.
You remember Silence of the Lambs? I think Hannibal Lecter killed one of the bassoon players from the Baltimore Symphony because he was playing out of tune. So you got to be careful if you're.
Well, that would do it for me too. Just getting back to something that you said, I have a lot of respect for Mozart
mm-hmm.
and what he wrote and the range of what he wrote, but I don't particularly like him.
Yeah, I have other friends who feel the same way, literally, about Mozart.
Yeah, and for me, whenever I hear particularly up to his final few works, I always feel I know what the next note is.
I understand that, and I used to feel that way, and then I started hearing his work very differently. If you listen to it instead of the small melodic changes, but you listen for the changes in where it's going to go harmonically and where it's going to do changes in key, then it becomes very different and very surprising. So that's something that he got from Haydn, I believe, maybe CPE, Bach, and Haydn, but probably especially Haydn. I would agree that for a great deal of Mozart work, you know how that phrase is going to end because you've heard that phrase even from Mozart 200 times.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listen in larger chunks instead of second by second, but now you listen minute to minute, there's a hell of a lot of surprise in Mozart.
It's very similar to talking about movie music. I don't particularly like movie music because it doesn't have a long arc.
Mm-hmm.
It only has the short scene.
Mm-hmm.
And there were few composers who could pull off soundtracks beyond this scene. Prokofiev is one, for example.
Mm-hmm.
He was such a grand composer anyway. So
yeah.
his music was, or even for soundtracks, was composed with a longer purpose in mind.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's very. I wrote some soundtracks.
Right.
And then I've arranged some soundtracks, mostly the arrangements with John Cale. But when you arrange, you can really rewrite them. So I shot Andy Warhol, right? The soundtrack sounded, I believe, quite different when I get done with it, I think. although it's all John's compositions. But what I found is one reason that I haven't pursued commercial soundtrack work very much is it's really disappointing. Now, if you've got to make a living, it's a different thing. Now that there's so few ways to make a living in music, it makes a lot of sense that people go after soundtracks. But if you're writing for a typical big budget or moderate budget movie, your soundtrack will be chopped absolutely into bits, no matter what you do, no matter how good it is, because it's subservient to the story. Given that, you just have to go and you have to realize it. You have to be willing to deal with it. I'm not. I don't have enough time for that. If I'm going to be writing stuff, I'm squeezing it in on the weekends. And so I want to do things that are important. There's a movie called The Violinist that I made with Winsome Brown and a violinist named Rebecca Cherry. And for that, it's actually based on the music. So I'm happy with it. Winsome still chopped up the music, but it's still about the music. And mostly it says what I would like the music to have it to say. Then I just made a video version of my opera called The Eighth Hour of Amdua. And, I control it. So I just have the music playing from beginning to end. So that kind of thing I like. And not just my own, I'm enjoying in the past, for instance, playing on Phil Niblock film pieces, even if I'm just playing one note that goes on for an hour and a half, because it all hangs together for me. If you're going to do commercial work, you must understand that the point is the storytelling, and music is going to be subservient for that.
Right.
The fact that Prokofiev could do such a great job under those conditions is really quite astonishing.
All right. I know we have talked for an hour.
Okay.
That was great.
All right, William, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right, man.
Okay, William, thank you. Appreciate it.
You take care. Okay. And hey, good luck with the book.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You take care.
I like hearing all about what you said. I love the fact that I why don't you go and think that you could argue? Because the more people have how it's funny, the next so laugh. Yeah, I think that's